The inviting aroma of garlic and rosemary swirled through the spacious kitchen, as Daniel Finch skillfully sliced a medley of vegetables for dinner. The rhythmic thud of his knife against the cutting board resonated in the quiet of his luxurious penthouse. At 42, Daniel was a man who commanded attention. Tall, with broad shoulders and intense steel-gray eyes that could gauge a person's intentions from across a room. These perceptive eyes had steered him through the competitive world of real estate, where he had built Finch Realty into a prominent and respected firm in the city. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the sleek, stainless steel appliances and polished marble counters, all custom-chosen during the last renovation. Cooking had become a cherished ritual for him, a rare chance to step away from the high-stakes deals and endless demands of his career, finding peace in the simple act of preparing a meal. The soft click of heels against the hardwood broke his concentration, drawing his gaze upward. His wife, Josephine, breezed into the kitchen, her presence striking and slightly unnerving. She wore a fitted black dress he didn't recognize, one that clung to her figure and left little to the imagination. What caught his attention even more was her perfume, a sophisticated scent he hadn't gifted her, its floral and amber notes filling the air. Without so much as a glance in his direction, Josephine paused to adjust her lipstick in the microwave's reflection. "Don't wait up," she said casually, her tone dismissive. She tossed the words over her shoulder, as if he were merely an afterthought. "I'm going out tonight. Meeting someone." Daniel's hand stilled on the knife. A hard knot formed in his chest as he watched her, maintaining an outward calm. 14 years of marriage had brought them through highs and lows, from his empire's rise to supporting her ambitious but fruitless ventures. A fashion boutique that failed, a jewelry line that never launched, a blog that withered without readers. Through it all, he'd never imagined she would become so brazen, so openly indifferent. He forced himself to speak, his voice steady yet with a hardness unfamiliar to his own ears. "What is this, Josephine?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk out on a whim?" The weight of his words, quiet but firm, carried the authority that made his business partners respect him and rivals yield. Josephine's laugh rang out, a bitter, mocking sound that filled the room. "I'm seeing Fernando," she replied with a smirk, reapplying her lipstick. "He's been waiting for me to tell you, and honestly, I'm done with this charade. So here it is. Don't wait up." For a long moment, Daniel studied her with an assessing gaze, as though evaluating a property on the verge of collapse. He saw past the carefully styled hair and expensive dress, past the layers of makeup, to the entitlement, selfishness, and callousness beneath. Every word of hers hit like an insult that reached deeper than he'd realized she could go. His voice dropped, icy and precise. "If you walk out that door, it's over between us." The words hung in the air, charged with a finality he knew she had not expected. His gaze remained steady, unflinching, his reflection mirrored in the microwave as he stared at her. Josephine turned to face him fully, her expression smug and dismissive. "Don't be dramatic, Daniel. Who else would tolerate you? Your endless business meetings, your obsession with control, your pathetic attempts to play the devoted husband. Fernando understands what it means to live. You've been stuck playing house in this sterile penthouse for years." With a derisive smile, she grabbed her designer handbag, a gift from him, no less, for their anniversary, and turned towards the door, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, each step punctuating her disdain. The housekeeper, Maria, appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of shock as she witnessed the scene. She had worked for the Finches for a decade, growing fond of Daniel for his respectful and considerate ways. But she had noticed a shift in Josephine over the last year. The extravagant spending, the impatience, the harsh tone she'd started to use even with those who had been loyal for years. "Maria," Daniel said quietly, his gaze not leaving his wife. "You may take the rest of the day off. I'll ensure you're compensated." "Thank you, Mr. Finch," Maria replied softly, shooting a disapproving glance at Josephine as she left, shaking her head. Josephine rolled her eyes, her expression as dismissive as ever. Your kindness is impressive, as always. Still trying to play the noble one. She paused at the doorway, her words laced with venom. Last chance, Daniel. Stay out of my way. With one final, cruel smile, she turned, her mocking laughter echoing off the high ceilings as she stepped out into the evening. The door closed behind her with a finality that resonated in the stillness. Daniel remained motionless, staring at the space where she had been. The room was silent, save for the quiet sizzle of the salmon still cooking on the stove. Slowly, he picked up his phone, his fingers steady as he scrolled through his contacts. He found the one he needed and made the call. The line connected quickly, and a gruff voice responded. "Yes, Mr. Finch?" "Rodney," Daniel said, his tone resolute. "Execute Plan 0. It's time." "Understood, sir," came the reply, efficient and calm. "Shall I notify Mr. Church as well?" "Yes, and Rodney, make sure everything is handled without leaving a trace. Tonight." Daniel ended the call and returned to the stove, plating his now-finished meal with the same precision he brought to every aspect of his life. The vegetables, still half-chopped on the cutting board, would go to waste, but that was a minor loss now. As he sat down to his solitary dinner, his phone began buzzing with incoming updates from his team, each message signaling the start of a meticulously planned response. The gentle clinking of silverware was the only sound in the penthouse as Daniel finished his meal, his expression unreadable. His phone continued buzzing intermittently, each notification a confirmation that every detail of his plan was underway. A message from Sue Wilkins, the private investigator he had hired months ago, contained surveillance photos he dreaded needing. But tonight, they served as evidence of his foresight, of his patience rewarded. In his home office, Daniel's monitors displayed a carefully curated array of security camera feeds, financial data, and a sequence of emails exchanged between his legal and security teams. The last piece of the puzzle had clicked into place when he saw Josephine's actions for himself, giving him all the confirmation he needed. A small knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Maria, the housekeeper, standing at the doorway. She lingered, concern etched across her face. "Mr. Finch, I know you said I could leave, but I wanted to make sure you were all right." Daniel's gaze softened as he nodded, grateful for her quiet presence. "Thank you, Maria, but I'm fine. Better than I've been, honestly." She nodded, understanding dawning in her expression. In the years she had worked for the Finches, she had become aware of Josephine's increasingly erratic behavior, the extravagant late-night outings, the endless stream of expensive purchases. Yet Daniel had remained kind and steady, the reliable presence she admired. "Take the next week off," he said. "With full pay, of course. When you return, things may look different around here." Maria's face softened, and she looked at him with something like sympathy. "She doesn't deserve you, Mr. Finch. Never did." With that, she turned and left, leaving Daniel in the silence of the dimly lit penthouse. Returning to his monitors, he saw a new email from Jeffrey Church, his attorney. The divorce papers had been finalized, documenting evidence of infidelity and financial misconduct. Daniel's grip on the mouse tightened as he skimmed the files. Another message from Rodney confirmed that the intricate web of financial transfers he'd arranged had started moving into place, safeguarding his assets in accounts beyond Josephine's reach. A quiet satisfaction settled over him as he absorbed these updates. Josephine's betrayal had not gone unnoticed, nor would it go unpunished. She had assumed his quiet nature was a sign of weakness, mistaking patience for passivity. But soon, she would learn the cost of underestimating a man who had carefully built his life from the ground up. Across town, Josephine laughed brightly in an upscale restaurant, her gaze never leaving Fernando's as he poured her another glass of champagne. Fernando, with his neatly styled hair, flawless designer suit, and carefully cultivated charm, was everything she'd wanted. An escape from the life she had shared with Daniel, a life she had come to resent. She took a long sip from her glass, relishing the attention Fernando lavished on her, the luxurious setting, the thrill of something forbidden. "You should have seen his face," she laughed, recalling her confrontation with Daniel. "He actually thought he could stop me." As if he had the power to control anything I do. Fernando reached across the table, his fingers tracing gentle circles on her hand, a smirk playing on his lips. Poor Daniel, he mocked. He's so used to having things his way. He'll never see it coming, what we've planned. Josephine's eyes sparkled with delight. Exactly. He's predictable, boring. He has no idea what we've been plotting all these months. Her laughter bubbled over, joining Fernando's, as they toasted to what they believed was their shared victory. What neither of them noticed was a woman sitting at the bar, seemingly engrossed in her phone, earbuds in as she sipped her drink. But her attention was anything but casual. Sue Wilkins had been following them for months, recording every meeting, every whispered plan, every damning piece of evidence. She snapped a quick photo of the two of them, their expressions gleeful and utterly unguarded. She forwarded the picture to Daniel with a concise message. Target meeting confirmed. Audio recording in progress. Back at the penthouse, Daniel was now seated in his home office, scrolling through documents, his expression serene and focused. He had already set in motion everything he needed to unravel his marriage and secure his assets. The necessary evidence, photos, audio recordings, and financial records, were now aligned perfectly, ready to paint a clear picture of Josephine's deception. The evening shadows lengthened as Daniel reviewed the last messages from his team. Rodney's final message confirmed that the security system he had installed months ago, capturing various angles of his own home, was working smoothly. Even as he sat at his desk, he could watch the scene from earlier, reliving Josephine's biting words, her utter disregard for the life they'd shared. Once he would have grieved the loss. But tonight, as he leaned back in his leather chair, a sense of calm clarity washed over him. The years of patience, of careful planning, had culminated in this very moment. Josephine's betrayal had freed him in ways he hadn't realized until now. With each message, each document prepared, he felt his old life, built on a fragile facade, slipping away, replaced by something stronger, something unbreakable. He placed his phone down and allowed himself a rare smile. The weight of his decision had lifted, leaving behind a surprising lightness. Soon, Josephine and Fernando would discover just how deeply they had miscalculated. The life they had envisioned at his expense would vanish, leaving them with nothing but the consequences of their greed. As night fell, Daniel sat quietly in his home office, letting the quiet hum of the monitors and the soft glow of city lights through the windows envelop him. His mind drifted over memories of the life he and Josephine had shared, the laughter they once had, and the dreams they'd built, or so he'd believed. That life felt distant now, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. The images on the monitors were the only reminders he needed of who she had truly become. A faint buzz from his phone drew his attention back to the present. It was another update from Rodney, his head of security. The plan to safeguard Daniel's assets was well underway. Offshore accounts were locked, real estate holdings secured, and key documents filed with his legal team. With each step, he felt the ties to his past life loosening, freeing him from the weight of Josephine's betrayal. Tonight, he wasn't just ending a marriage, he was reclaiming control over his future. In an upscale corner of the city, the cozy ambience of the restaurant buzzed with the chatter of well-dressed diners. Josephine and Fernando were toasting their victory, blissfully unaware that every whispered exchange was being recorded. Fernando, always careful to look the part of a successful entrepreneur, leaned in, his gaze calculated. He was playing a long game with Josephine, eyeing Daniel's empire with hungry anticipation. The pair laughed over candlelight, toasting each other with expensive champagne. Their arrogance was palpable, as if they had already stripped Daniel of everything. They believed him oblivious, wrapped in the dull routine they had dismissed as boring and predictable. Fernando, Josephine sighed dramatically. It's all going to be ours. His company, his assets, everything. I'll make sure he's out of the way for good. She took another sip, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous thrill. Unseen by the couple, Sue Wilkins remained close, discreetly snapping photos and recording every damning word. She listened to their whispered plans, knowing that each word sealed the trap Daniel had set with meticulous care. Every meeting, every secret glance, every incriminating conversation was being gathered, carefully preserved in a case file she would deliver to Daniel later that night. With each piece of evidence she collected, Sue felt a mix of satisfaction and respect for the quiet, calculating man who had hired her. He had seen this betrayal coming long before it unfolded. Back at the penthouse, Daniel received another message, a recording this time. He pressed play, hearing Josephine's laughter mingling with Fernando's as they plotted to drain his accounts. They spoke as though they were executing some brilliant coup, unaware that their words were now being catalogued as evidence against them. With each passing minute, the two people who had thought themselves untouchable were being drawn deeper into Daniel's carefully constructed web. The irony wasn't lost on him. They had mocked his predictability, yet every move they made fell perfectly in line with his predictions. The hours stretched into the early morning, and Daniel continued his quiet vigil, occasionally checking the emails and messages from his team. His attorney, Jeffrey, sent confirmation that the divorce papers were finalized, strengthened with a mountain of evidence. Everything Sue had collected, combined with the surveillance footage from his own home. Jeffrey's message was brief and efficient, but Daniel could sense the note of respect. It was, as Jeffrey put it, one of the most methodical, bulletproof cases he had ever handled. As the sun began to edge over the horizon, casting the first light on the city, Daniel closed his laptop. Content. He allowed himself a moment of silence, reflecting on how far he had come, from the man who had trusted too easily to the one who had learned, through betrayal, the value of foresight and patience. Soon, Josephine would awaken to a reality she had never anticipated, one where her plans would collapse like a house of cards. At a sleek, modern penthouse across the city, Josephine slowly opened her eyes, stretching luxuriously in the warmth of satin sheets. She turned to Fernando, still asleep beside her, his arm flung carelessly over the pillow. She smiled, savoring the feeling of victory and freedom. Today, she thought, would be the beginning of her new life, one where she was finally liberated from the constraints of her marriage. She had no idea that, even now, her carefully constructed plans were unraveling. The morning sun filtered into the penthouse through large, elegant windows, casting a soft glow on Daniel's still figure as he sipped his coffee, his thoughts as steady as his gaze. Everything was in place. By now, Josephine would be blissfully unaware that her carefully laid schemes were already collapsing. He felt a strange sense of calm, a clarity he hadn't felt in years, knowing he had the advantage she would never suspect. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Jeffrey Church, his attorney. The divorce papers, backed with indisputable evidence of infidelity, were en route to Josephine's mother's residence, where she had spent the night. Daniel's instructions were precise. The documents were to arrive before she even had a chance to take her morning coffee, setting the tone for the unraveling of her illusions. Daniel replied with a single word, "Proceed," and set down his phone. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the calm satisfaction of watching a plan executed to perfection. Meanwhile, at Josephine's mother's house across town, an unsuspecting Josephine was just starting her day. She descended the stairs, her face glowing with the smug satisfaction of her recent escapades. Her mother, Elena, noticed the slight smudges of makeup still clinging to her daughter's face, remnants of a night out, and frowned disapprovingly. "Someone was out late," Elena observed, her voice cool but tinged with concern. Josephine merely shrugged, reaching for the coffee pot without meeting her mother's gaze. But before she could pour herself a cup, a firm knock echoed through the house. Elena moved to answer, and Josephine's curiosity was piqued when she saw a man in a crisp suit holding an envelope. "Elena Torres?" the courier asked, and upon her nod, he handed her the envelope. "This is for your daughter," he said politely before turning to leave. "Josephine," Elena said, handing her the envelope, her brow furrowing as she studied her daughter's face. "What is this?" With a careless shrug, Josephine ripped open the envelope, but as her eyes skimmed the first page, her expression shifted from indifference to shock, then to horror. Divorce papers. And, As she turned the pages, photos spilled from the document. Photos of her and Fernando in compromising situations, captured with startling clarity. Her heart pounded as she leafed through the damning evidence. She could barely breathe as she processed the extent of Daniel's knowledge, the cold reality that he had been aware of her deceit for months. Divorce. Elena's voice cut through Josephine's stunned silence. Is that you in these photos? She picked up one of the incriminating pictures, her hand shaking slightly. He had me followed, Josephine choked, barely able to form words. The bitterness of betrayal gnawed at her as she realized how meticulously Daniel had tracked her every move. Her own husband had been playing a game far more elaborate than she had ever anticipated. Across town, in a suburban kitchen, Fernando was facing his own reckoning. His wife, Gladys, was waiting for him, her expression icy as she held a similar envelope. She'd opened it only moments earlier, and the pile of bank statements, photos, and transcripts from Daniel's investigator lay spread across the marble countertop. How long? Gladys asked, her voice like steel. How long have you been sneaking around with her? Gladys, listen. Fernando began, his tone placating, but she cut him off with a single, raised hand. Explain this, she demanded, stabbing a finger at the evidence. You've been draining our accounts and funneling the money into that failing real estate firm of yours. You think I wouldn't notice? You think I wouldn't find out? Fernando's usual charm faltered, his expression growing desperate as he scrambled for an explanation. It's not what it looks like. I was just trying to secure our future. Our future? She repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. You mean your future with her? She turned away, her jaw clenched. You planned to ruin Daniel, and you've ruined yourself instead. For the first time, Fernando had no smooth words, no practiced excuses. The truth, laid bare in the documents, left him with nothing but the bitter realization that his own greed had been his undoing. Back at the penthouse, Daniel took one last look around the home he had shared with Josephine for so many years. The memories that once haunted him had faded, replaced by a quiet sense of liberation. He checked his messages one final time, confirming that the assets had been secured, the accounts transferred, and every tie to Josephine severed. He dialed a number and waited for the line to connect. When he heard Rodney's voice, he simply said, "It's time." Rodney's team had already been dispatched. The locks were being changed, the security systems reset, and Josephine's belongings were packed and waiting in the garage. Every detail was in motion, flawlessly synchronized to ensure that she would never set foot in this penthouse again. And as the morning progressed, Josephine found herself helpless, frantically dialing Fernando's number, only to reach his voicemail time and again. Her frustration mounted, boiling over as she threw her phone across the room, fury and fear warring within her. In her moment of triumph, she had underestimated the one man who had known her better than she had known herself. Now, faced with the evidence of his silent planning, she was left reeling, caught in the aftermath of her own betrayal. As the morning wore on, Josephine made her way to the private bank she and Daniel had used for years, clutching her designer handbag with a determined expression. She approached the manager's desk, confident as ever, and slid her bank card across with a practiced smile. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," she announced, her voice carrying a touch of impatience. The manager's expression remained neutral as he checked the account details on his screen. But after a moment, he looked back up at her, his face showing a hint of discomfort. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Finch," he said in a calm but firm tone, "but this account has been frozen due to pending investigations. Additionally, your credit cards have been suspended as well." Josephine's smile faded, replaced by a look of confusion and anger. "What do you mean frozen? Do you have any idea who I am?" Her voice rose, causing a few heads to turn in the quiet lobby. The manager gave her a polite, apologetic smile. "Yes, ma'am, I do. We are also aware of the unauthorized transactions from these accounts into Mr. Fernando Lehman's accounts over the past several months. Our fraud department has extensive documentation on these activities." Josephine's face went from flushed red to a deathly pale white. She stumbled back a step, her confidence shattered as she absorbed his words. Desperately, she grabbed her phone and tried Fernando's number yet again, only to be met with the same voicemail message. Her world, carefully built on her plans with Fernando, was beginning to crumble before her eyes. Meanwhile, in a sleek, luxury hotel room across town, Daniel held a quiet meeting with his executive team. The transfer of Finch real estate to an international holding company was proceeding seamlessly, with clauses ensuring the security of all employees in the contract. His empire would live on, stronger than ever, even as he slipped out of his former life, leaving no trace for anyone to follow. A soft knock on the door signaled the arrival of his financial advisor, who approached with a brief update. "All offshore accounts are secure, Mr. Finch. Mrs. Finch has no access to any of it. The documentation has been meticulously filed." "Excellent," Daniel replied with a calm satisfaction. He turned to Sue Wilkins, who placed a USB drive on the table. "This contains everything: security footage from your home, audio recordings, bank statements, and photos. Every meeting, every conversation, every instance of misconduct is accounted for." He nodded, glancing at the drive for a moment before picking it up. "Send copies to Jeffrey, Fernando's wife, and the fraud investigators. I want everyone to know the truth about who they were dealing with." Back at the penthouse, the final phase of the plan was well underway. A moving truck was parked in the driveway, its workers efficiently carrying out furniture and boxes of Josephine's belongings. They worked with the precision of professionals who had handled high-profile moves before, each item carefully packed and labeled under Rodney's supervision. At that very moment, Josephine returned to the penthouse, her emotions a chaotic mixture of fury, desperation, and confusion. She barely noticed the moving trucks at first, marching straight to the front door, ready to confront Daniel. But as she opened the door, she stopped short, her mouth falling open at the sight of strangers removing furniture from the home she once shared with him. What is going on here?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper as she watched the movers take out pieces of her life. A man in a tailored suit approached her, holding out a set of legal documents. "Mrs. Finch, this property was sold early this morning. The transfer of ownership is already complete. As per the terms of the sale, your belongings have been packed and placed in the garage for your convenience." Josephine snatched the papers from him, her hands trembling as she flipped through page after page of what was, indeed, a legitimate sale. Everything was there in black and white, legally binding and irrefutable. Her heart pounded with dread, and she looked up, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. This can't be happening," she whispered, clutching the papers as if they were the last shreds of her reality. "He can't do this to me." The man in the suit simply raised an eyebrow. "He already has Mrs. Finch. I suggest you retrieve your belongings from the garage before 5 p.m., or they will be considered abandoned property." Stunned and hollow, Josephine stumbled toward the garage, barely aware of her surroundings as she took in the sight of her boxed-up life. There, in neatly packed containers, lay her designer clothes, handbags, shoes, and the symbols of her carefully constructed social status. Each box was a reminder of the life she had crafted, one she had now lost entirely. Her hand shook as she pulled out her phone, dialing her mother's number. When Elena answered, Josephine could barely choke back her tears. "Mom, I need help. Daniel sold the house, froze the accounts. He's taken everything," she sobbed. A hard silence hung on the other end of the line before Elena finally spoke, her voice colder than Josephine had ever heard.
"No, Josephine.
You're the one who destroyed everything. I received copies of recordings this morning. Your own voice mocking him, planning to ruin him. What kind of person does that?" "But, Mom," Josephine stammered, her voice a desperate plea. "I didn't mean it. You have to believe me." "No," Elena replied, her tone resolute. "You made your choice, Josephine. Now you'll have to live with the consequences." The call ended abruptly, leaving Josephine alone among the remnants of her former life. She sank to her knees, surrounded by her designer possessions, the cold reality of her situation settling over her. One by one, the doors she had relied upon were closing, leaving her isolated and vulnerable. In that moment, the penthouse that had once symbolized everything she thought she deserved became a stark reminder of what she had thrown away. She had called Daniel weak, boring, predictable. She had thought he would stand by passively, just as he always had. But in her arrogance, she had underestimated the quiet man she once thought she could manipulate. And now, she was left to confront the full weight of her choices, alone. A cold, hard reality set in for Josephine over the next few days. The lavish life she'd once enjoyed had been stripped away, piece by piece, until she was left with little more than her clothes and a dwindling account of borrowed funds. She clung to her phone, scrolling through old photos, desperately searching for any remnant of the confidence and power she had once felt. But each picture only reminded her of what she had lost. Meanwhile, Daniel's life was moving forward in ways she could never have imagined. In his exclusive hotel suite, he continued to finalize the last stages of his exit from his old life. Every day, he received reports confirming that his holdings were secure, his properties sold, and his assets legally untouchable. Jeffrey and Rodney continued coordinating the details, ensuring that Josephine would never find another loophole, another chance to reach him. In her small hotel room, Josephine was now left facing the bitter consequences of her actions. Desperately, she had tried to contact her remaining friends, but each call went unanswered, and each message was met with indifference or curt replies. One final message came from a close friend she had known for years, a simple statement that cut deeper than she had expected. "I thought I knew you. Don't contact me again." Across town, Fernando was facing his own unraveling. His wife, Glenda, had allowed him back into their home, but with new, unyielding conditions. Every expenditure was scrutinized, every transaction reviewed. His once grand dreams of merging his real estate firm with Daniel's empire were now replaced with daily humiliations. His accounts frozen, his business plans dismissed by every investor who had once trusted him. As Josephine faced her isolation, her mind wandered to Daniel, wondering what he was doing, where he was. She could hardly believe he was the same man she'd once seen as boring, predictable. How had he, of all people, managed to outwit her so completely? Late one evening, as she sat in her room, her phone buzzed with another message. This time it was from an investigator she had hired. A last attempt to locate Daniel, to find some means of salvaging what she had lost. But the message was brief, and even colder than she had expected. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Finch. Every lead goes cold. Mr. Finch has erased his tracks. Business sold, accounts closed, digital footprint gone. He's a ghost. This will be our last update." Her heart sank. It was as though Daniel had simply vanished, leaving behind no trace, no chance for her to follow. The man she had once thought predictable had disappeared into a life beyond her reach, leaving her to confront a world that no longer welcomed her. In his luxurious hotel suite, Daniel took one last look at his emails and updates, confirming the final details with Rodney and Jeffrey. Every trace of his old life had been erased, each loose end tied up with the precision he had applied to his business deals. Tonight would be his last night in the city he had called home. By morning, he would be on a plane, on his way to a new life, far from the betrayals and schemes he had left behind. That night, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He stood by the window, looking out over the city skyline, illuminated by thousands of lights. The city had once represented everything he had built, every ambition he had pursued. But now it was simply a backdrop, a reminder of a life he had outgrown. Tomorrow he would be free, free from the past, free from the bitterness that had once gripped him, and free to live on his own terms. As he looked out over the city, he felt an unshakable sense of peace, a clarity that came from knowing he had taken control of his fate. Across town, Josephine lay awake in her small, dimly lit room, haunted by thoughts of the man she had betrayed, the life she had destroyed with her own hands. Her dreams of wealth and power had turned to ash, leaving her with nothing but regret. She had believed she could manipulate him, that he would be too weak to act. But she had been wrong. And as she lay in the quiet of the night, Josephine finally understood the truth. She had played with fire, mistaking Daniel's patience for weakness, his kindness for foolishness. She had misjudged him completely, and now she was left to live with the consequences. The next morning, as dawn broke over the city, Daniel quietly left his hotel, a single suitcase in hand. Every detail of his departure had been planned meticulously. By the time anyone realized he was gone, he would be miles away, beyond the reach of those who had once thought they could control or manipulate him. His destination was a private island, a hidden sanctuary he had purchased under an untraceable corporation years ago. He had kept it a secret, even from Josephine, as a kind of escape he'd imagined someday using. Now it would be the beginning of his new life, a place where he could live on his own terms, far from the betrayal and deception he'd endured. As his plane ascended into the sky, Daniel took one last look at the city below, feeling an unexpected lightness. The burdens he'd carried for so long had lifted, leaving him with a profound sense of peace. He had survived the worst of it, and now he was truly free. Meanwhile, Josephine's life continued to spiral downward. She returned to the small storage unit where her belongings had been stashed, each box a painful reminder of her former life. The luxury, the power, the social standing. Everything she had once prided herself on had been stripped away, leaving her with nothing but the bitter taste of regret. Her mother, Elena, had finally relented and allowed her to stay in the small guest house behind the family home. But their relationship had become strained and tense. Elena, once proud of her daughter's social rise, now watched her with a kind of disappointed resignation, unable to understand how Josephine had fallen so far. At dinner one evening, Josephine tried to make light conversation, mentioning old friends and social events she had once attended. But Elena cut her off sharply. "Those days are over, Josephine. It's time you face the consequences of your choices and learn to live without relying on others to clean up your mess." Josephine's face flushed with shame, but she had no response. She had lost the privilege of argument. There was no justification for what she had done. She was learning, slowly and painfully, that the life she had once taken for granted was gone, replaced by a bleak, uncertain future. In another part of the city, Fernando's existence had also been reduced to a shadow of what it once was. The suave businessman, once proud and ambitious, now worked in a small, modest firm managed by Glenda's family. His days were spent in a cramped cubicle, completing menial tasks under the watchful eye of colleagues who had once been his subordinates. His reputation had taken a fatal hit. Whispers of his affair, his attempted schemes, and his financial misconduct had spread through his former social circle, leaving him as a pariah, someone to be avoided and distrusted. Each day was a reminder of the life he had lost, a life he had foolishly thrown away. Glenda had imposed strict rules, controlling every aspect of his life with an iron grip. His credit cards had been revoked, his access to their joint finances monitored closely. The man who had once dreamed of grandeur now faced a life of restricted freedom, his every movement scrutinized, his dreams reduced to empty ambitions. Back on the island, Daniel stepped onto the white sand, breathing in the scent of the ocean. His private villa, an elegant structure built with natural materials and nestled in the lush greenery, stood waiting for him. It was a sanctuary of tranquility and seclusion, a place where he could finally let go of the bitterness that had once consumed him. In his new office overlooking the ocean, he reviewed reports from his growing network of businesses. Finch real estate was only one part of the empire he had quietly built, using shell companies and offshore accounts to expand his reach far beyond what Josephine or Fernando had ever known. His ventures were thriving, his influence growing quietly and steadily. Every so often, he would receive updates on Josephine and Fernando, detailing their struggles, their disappointments. He read them not with pleasure or glee, but with a quiet satisfaction. They were living with the consequences of their choices, reaping what they had sown in their greed and deceit. One evening, as he watched the sun sink into the horizon, Daniel allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He had once loved Josephine deeply, and part of him had mourned the loss of that love. But now, with the ocean stretching endlessly before him, he felt only relief, relief that he had taken control of his life, that he had freed himself from those who had betrayed him. Far away, Josephine was learning a harsh lesson, that her actions had led her to this life, that the choices she had made in her pursuit of excitement and wealth had cost her everything. She had tried to outsmart a man she had never fully understood, mistaking his patience and kindness for weakness. But now, as she sat alone in a dimly lit room, she finally understood the truth. She had underestimated Daniel, and it was a mistake she would carry for the rest of her life. Months passed, and Josephine's life became a series of monotonous days filled with reminders of her fall from grace. She worked various jobs to make ends meet, no longer the polished socialite she once was. Each day was marked by quiet humiliations, from cleaning tables in restaurants where she used to dine to hearing whispers from former friends who crossed the street to avoid her. The exclusive clubs and social events she once attended no longer welcomed her. Her name had become synonymous with scandal, her betrayal and schemes now a sordid tale shared among society's elite as a cautionary story. For Josephine, each interaction, each cold glance, was a stark reminder of the life she had destroyed. Her mother, Elena, had finally cut off support, refusing to enable her any longer. "You'll have to learn how to live with what you've done, Josephine," Elena had said, her voice filled with a disappointment that cut deeper than anger. "You traded everything that mattered for a fleeting thrill, and now you have to live with the consequences." In the city's quiet suburbs, Fernando found himself trapped in a similar purgatory. Glenda had permitted him to stay, but their marriage had become a lifeless arrangement, devoid of trust or warmth. She made it clear that his every move would be scrutinized, his every expense questioned. The suave businessman, once confident and ambitious, was now reduced to a man bound by restrictions, constantly under suspicion. At work, his colleagues treated him with thinly veiled disdain, whispers of his affair and his failed schemes following him wherever he went. His reputation was beyond repair, and his dreams of grandeur had withered into resentment and frustration. He realized bitterly, living the life of a man defeated by his own arrogance. Meanwhile, Daniel's life on the island was one of quiet prosperity. His new ventures flourished, his businesses expanding across continents, each one strategically planned to ensure stability and growth. He received periodic updates on the lives he had left behind, not out of malice, but as a reminder of the path he had chosen, and the one he had escaped. From a distance, he watched as Josephine and Fernando struggled, the weight of their choices pressing down on them with every passing day. He read about Josephine's latest job, her attempt to rebuild a life from scratch, a stark contrast to the lavish lifestyle she had once taken for granted. Fernando's struggles were equally apparent. His failed attempts to regain credibility and establish a new business were met with closed doors and polite refusals. One evening, as Daniel looked over the reports in his office, a small note caught his attention. It was a message from a contact in the city, a brief update on Josephine's latest job. She was working at a modest hotel, cleaning rooms, her once manicured hands now worn from labor. He sat back, the image clear in his mind. The woman who had once sneered at his boring life was now experiencing a reality far harsher than anything he could have imagined. He felt a quiet satisfaction, not out of vengeance, but from the knowledge that the natural course of justice had played out. On the island, Daniel's life was filled with a peace he hadn't known in years. His mornings were spent overlooking the ocean, his afternoons devoted to managing his growing empire, and his evenings filled with the simple pleasures he had once dismissed in his pursuit of success. He was finally free from the expectations and obligations of his former life, free from the betrayals that had once haunted him. Across the miles, Josephine struggled to adapt to her new reality. Each day was a reminder of her mistakes, her regrets echoing in the silence of her modest apartment. She had lost everything: her home, her friends, her reputation, all in pursuit of excitement she had once believed would fulfill her. Now, all that remained were memories of a life she could never reclaim. Fernando, too, felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. Each attempt to start anew ended in rejection, each effort met with suspicion and doubt. The ambitious man who had once schemed with Josephine was now reduced to a shell of his former self. His every move monitored, his every decision questioned. And Daniel, watching from afar, knew that he had achieved something far more valuable than revenge. He had found freedom. Freedom from the past, freedom from the expectations that had once defined him, and freedom from the bitterness that had once threatened to consume him. For Josephine and Fernando, however, there would be no such peace. They had plotted to take everything from him, only to find themselves living in the ruins of their own making. Their punishment was not one he had orchestrated, but one that came naturally from the lives they had chosen to lead. And as Daniel watched the sun set over his island, he knew he had won, not through anger or vengeance, but by simply allowing them to face the consequences of their choices. 5 years had passed since Daniel Finch's quiet departure, and life had settled into a new rhythm for those he left behind. Josephine, once a figure of elegance and status, now worked in the budget dining room of the Sunrise Plaza Hotel. She was far from the luxurious life she had known, her once manicured hands now worn from the endless hours of work. Each morning, she served coffee and cleared tables, her days filled with the humbling routine of service. She had long since discarded the designer dresses and polished heels, now replaced with a plain uniform and practical shoes. Her old life felt like a distant memory, a dream that had slipped through her fingers. On the rare occasion when former acquaintances or friends passed through the hotel, they barely recognized her. Some didn't even acknowledge her, and others exchanged uncomfortable glances, unwilling to associate with the woman whose betrayal had become the stuff of whispered legend. Across town, Fernando's life had become equally subdued. He now lived in a modest suburban home with Glenda, who kept a close eye on him and restricted every aspect of his financial life. Fernando worked a low-level job at Glenda's brother's construction firm, where his talents went unappreciated, his every decision scrutinized. The charming, confident man who had once envisioned taking over Daniel's empire was now little more than an employee, his former ambition reduced to quiet frustration and bitter resignation. In their diminished lives, Josephine and Fernando each carried a heavy burden, the knowledge that they had destroyed themselves. The thrill they had once felt, the excitement they had pursued, had come at a cost they never anticipated. And now, each day served as a reminder of what they had once had, and the choices that had led them to lose it all. Meanwhile, on his secluded island, Daniel Finch had built a life of quiet prosperity. His ventures thrived, his empire expanded across continents, and his new life was marked by the peace he had once thought unattainable. In those early days, he had spent time reflecting on the betrayal, on the pain of realizing the woman he had loved had never truly valued him. But as the years went by, the bitterness faded, replaced by a calm sense of closure. One evening, as he reviewed his latest projects, he received a familiar message from Rodney, his head of security. A brief update on Josephine's situation. She was now living with her mother, unable to afford even a modest apartment on her own. Fernando, too, was barely making ends meet. Daniel read the update without emotion, allowing himself a moment of reflection. He thought back to the years he had spent with Josephine, the life they had shared, and the betrayal that had once felt like a scar. Now it was nothing more than a distant memory, a chapter in a book he had long since closed. He knew he had been wise to let go, to let their actions destroy them rather than wasting his energy on vengeance. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Daniel raised his glass to the future. He had found a life richer and more fulfilling than he had ever thought possible, a life built on integrity, patience, and resilience. And as he stood on the deck of his villa, he allowed himself a small smile, knowing he had chosen the right path. Far from the city he had left behind, far from the betrayals and schemes, he was at peace. For Josephine and Fernando, however, there would be no such relief. They would continue to live with the weight of their choices, the knowledge that they had once held happiness in their hands only to destroy it in their greed and arrogance. Their lives, marked by struggle and regret, were the lasting echoes of a lesson learned too late, that true strength lies in patience, in kindness, and in the quiet confidence of those who do not need to prove themselves. And as the night settled over the city, Josephine, Fernando, and Daniel each faced their own truths. One in a quiet room, one in a modest office, and one on a sunlit island, far beyond their reach.